Shavua Tov. I'd like to dedicate this shiur to David and Rachel Stern. I was very sorry to miss the Machon Shilo event last week, the Seudat Hodaya for them. I listened to recordings of some of the speeches given, and I think I'm just in awe of their courage, and it was very moving to hear their words and those of Jonathan Pollard. And I think I expect there may be more recordings that will come out as well that I still haven't gotten a chance to enjoy, but I feel great regret that I didn't get to make it there, and I feel as well inspired to try to say something in this shiur that I hope might be relevant to the same kind of discussion. So I was reading, actually I'll start with a source that is very far from Tanakh. I was reading an article in the Times of Israel this evening that is about a recent statement made by Rav Moshe Lichtenstein, who's the head of Yeshivat Har Etzion in Gush Etzion. The article was in Times of Israel, published, I guess maybe yesterday, and the title is "Head of Prestigious Yeshiva, Settler Riots, a Moral Stain on Us All, contravene Torah." And I think in the spirit of beginning with what can be said that is positive, the same way that the students of Hillel would acknowledge the arguments of those with whom they would seek to disagree before disagreeing. I certainly have been a great beneficiary over the years of many different sources of Torah learning that have come out of Yeshivat Har Etzion. I think there are many brilliant minds there, and it's clear that in one sense it is a place where there's a great deal of profound knowledge of Torah, and where one can learn a lot about how to study Tanakh, about how to study Talmud. At the same time, I can't quite say I'm disappointed in the sense of surprised by the remarks that I'm about to quote, because it's also true that Yeshivat Har Etzion tends to take a very self-regarding and enlightened view when it comes to politics, and particularly politics as pertains to Israel and its security and things like that. But these remarks in particular, I think, are a jumping off point for a response that I think fits the moment. So I'll just read some quotations from the articles first. Rabbi Moshe Lichtenstein, the co-head of the prestigious Har Etzion Religious Seminary in the Alon Shvut settlement in the West Bank, spoke in a Facebook post of, quote, a double pain, both for the deaths of innocent Israelis who were murdered in cold blood, quote, in recent terror attacks in the West Bank, as well as, quote, pain for the acts of revenge by lost and misbegotten souls. Lichtenstein said he was disappointed that clear and sharp condemnations had not so far been issued by key leaders in the communities from which Jewish assailants had come, and thus, quote, I will allow myself to sound the cry. And went on to say, he said the entire public is responsible, quote, is responsible for creating the atmosphere that allowed these acts to take place, end quote, and thus must conduct serious soul searching. And the last bit that I will just read is, while stressing the security forces should act aggressively against terror, he underlined that, quote, harm to those who have not committed a crime is a moral and religious wrong that stands in opposition to all values of the Torah, end quote, and is, quote, also a desecration of God, end quote. Lichtenstein noted that, quote, the central problem with sowing destruction in Palestinian villages is not the loss of governance or the harm to settlement community, but rather the moral wrong, end quote, of the act. And he said one could not, quote, ignore the historic associative connection to pogroms in Jewish villages across the generations and our responsibility in light of brackets this past toward villages we control, end quote. Now, this is an article, so it's not the whole remarks. So it could be that there are elements in the entirety of the remarks that might in some way balance these comments. But I think there are a number of things in these comments that span the range between, I would say, irresponsibly vague in dealing with a very important issue that should require a carefulness in thinking about the implications in Torah that seems to be absent here. And I'll explain what I mean by that. It spans the range from there over to being simply disgraceful. And the easy thing to point out that is simply disgraceful is the last thing that I quoted, which is a mention of pogroms, right? That it's a favorite thing now, if anywhere Jews ever act in a way that seems unruly and destructive and threatening towards communities that have been a source of murderers of Jews, that this is somehow the shoe on the other foot, where now the pogrom is being committed by the Jews. And the use of the word pogrom is very deliberate. It's meant to shame Jews into looking in the mirror and asking, oh, what have I become? And there's something disgracefully inaccurate and manipulative about the use of this term, which anyone, I think, with a sober and accurate knowledge of Jewish history and of the Jewish present should be able to recognize. Because, first of all, we have no reason to generalize the term pogrom into an abstract category that makes it a tool in the hands of whoever wants to accuse whomever else of engaging in certain kinds of behavior. The idea of the pogrom came out of Jewish history as the notion of nations amongst whom the Jews were living gathering together to go and attack and murder Jews and destroy their homes, but particularly to murder them, and to talk in terms that makes a pogrom sound like it's a tool that can be turned around and inflicted by Jews on someone else. There's no reason to begin with to take this term and give it a more general meaning. But as soon as one does, interestingly, it reverberates back into one's understanding of history. You know, I doubt this was the intention of Rav Lichtenstein, but of course the implication of using a term like this is to suggest that we consider whether perhaps there might have been something that Jews murdered by Cossacks in the Pale of Settlement, you know, could have done to inflame or anger the Cossacks, right? Because the current riots that have gone on in the last, recently and also in the last few months in Yehuda and Shomron, obviously have had driving forces behind them as harsh and horrific as the murder of Jews by their Arab neighbors in Yehuda and Shomron. And to the degree that that's the case, calling this a pogrom is taking the notion of a pogrom and saying this is a thing that can happen, where it's in a sense a retaliation for the worst sort of horrific violence being inflicted on oneself. And so in this case, where clearly the Jews were doing whatever it is that they're doing, which by the way has led to some destruction of property, but has, unlike actual pogroms, not so far led to loss of life on the other side in any significant number or possibly at all, depending on how you calculate it, that these events in the present are an outcry coming from the communal pain of recent multiple or mass murders, and to take that and add it to the definition of a pogrom is it's spitting in the eye of generations of Jews who lived through actual pogroms, and it's an activity that many Jews are very willing to engage in because the knowledge we gained from Jewish history and what was inflicted on us is somehow very, very cheap, or it's quickly for sale as an abstraction to be used to self-criticize, to denounce other Jews, and to morally condemn ourselves, as though the point of it was just to learn some general lesson for humanity, as opposed perhaps to learning that we should be trying to prevent people from murdering Jews because of how much it used to happen when we didn't have the means. So just on the basis of that, I think these comments become suspect and really beyond that, as I said before, disgraceful. And I don't think the abuse of and cheapening of the term pogrom in this comment, it's not limited to this comment. It's part of a more general activity of stereotypical, and I would say mostly, if not entirely, Ashkenazic Jewish self-hatred, or let's say self-undermining or self-flagellation before the perceived world community looking on. And this kind of rhetoric needs to be right out and not part of how we explain what's going on to each other or to the rest of the world, because it just emboldens people who would commit actual pogroms, which I think we can retain as being a word defined to mean mob behavior that leads to the mass murder of Jews. So that's a first point. I think also more generally in these comments, it has to be acknowledged as well that there's something very thin, as I mentioned at the beginning, about this idea of what's going on is a crime is the term, harm, because harm to those who have not committed a crime is a moral and religious wrong that stands in opposition to all the values of the Torah. Sorry, so it's being called a moral failing and a desecration because it's about harm being done to those who haven't committed a crime. So again, in the spirit of acknowledging the sense of someone else's argument, clearly it's easy to understand the idea that riotous behavior should be condemned and should be prevented, because lawlessness rarely leads to the best kind of behavior, the most effective or the most morally acceptable. And so it's not difficult to relate to the sensible side of anyone who's standing up, or rather I'd say it's not difficult from the perspective of Torah to relate to the sensible side of anyone who's standing up and saying, let's put a stop to riotous behavior, let's be more disciplined about this somehow. But I think these comments go very far in excoriating Jews who've been acting this way in a way that isn't backed up by the comments. Like, to say that it's a moral and religious wrong that stands in opposition to all values of the Torah, well, all values of the Torah is a very big set of things. And it is important for us to ask whether indeed that's really a fair statement. And in any case, I would have hoped, and here's where, to be fair, these are quotations in the Times of Israel. It's not clear that the Times of Israel how much they're cherry picking the full statement. So perhaps it would be fair to look at the whole statement, but I kind of doubt that I would find there what I would have hoped from, what I would have hoped to hear from someone representing or carrying the banner of Torah here, which is an argument actually from the standpoint of Torah. Instead of just making a summary dismissal, let's talk about what is the problem here. And you could say different things. You could say, okay, dina machuta dina, like if it's illegal to do something, even when you're being ruled by goyim who don't necessarily have laws that are based on Torah, then generally speaking, except in certain exceptional circumstances, you're supposed to obey the law. And so lawlessness is, asur, it's prohibited by the rabbis, and we should decry it, right? So you could make that kind of argument. That would be an actual argument from Torah, and this is kal v'chomer, because this is, in a Jewish society, where the laws perhaps, although they aren't based on Torah per se, they are closer to that than in another setting where dina malchuta dina might have still applied. So that's one kind of argument you could make. Another kind of argument that you could make is, on the other hand, that maybe this isn't a situation where we're talking about criminal proceedings, so to speak, and that there's a different construct to put on this that also deserves discussion from the standpoint of Torah, right? Because looking at things through the lens of who is a criminal and who is not, like who's committed a crime and who hasn't, that's one way of looking at it, where there's a sense from the standpoint of Torah. There's another way of looking at it that says there are situations that are called wars, and in wars, different kinds of behaviors become permitted or forbidden, and it's a different construct that we put on it that also comes from the Torah. And who gets harmed during a war and what is moral or acceptable in the eyes of Torah is a different set of things, or is a different set of people than we're looking at this in terms of criminal procedure. Now, this is, I would say, especially a pertinent point to make in a situation where you also have to consider the right of people to self-defense, meaning that and this is now, the political comment, if you look at the situation, Yehuda Shimron, I think a much broader range of people might agree that having lawless, riotous behavior be some kind of component in a strategy for fighting back against an enemy is not really necessarily the best idea if you're going to be effective. But if a condition is created where Jews whose lives are constantly in danger and are being constantly attacked by an enemy have their hands tied, and they're not allowed to have weapons, or they're not allowed to use the weapons that they have to fight, to defend themselves effectively, because of a regime that establishes a system of regulations and a system that supposedly exists to defend them, but isn't sufficient in the way that it does that. At what point does it become the case that acting in self-defense involves acting lawlessly, right? That is something that has to be asked, when we're talking about people who seemingly have relatively little inclination to act lawlessly, but maybe have been driven to the brink by a chronic condition of being made to live like sitting ducks without enough being done to defend them on the roads or in their homes or wherever else. So that isn't a call to lawless behavior or even entirely necessarily an attempt to justify lawless behavior on its face, but it's an analysis of a condition that says, if you don't want these kinds of things to happen, then maybe the solution to the problem doesn't lie in, especially when talking about the leader of a religious community, like what should a leader like Rav Lichtenstein be saying? Maybe it would be more useful to be saying that we all want a world in which Jews never feel the need to act this way, but we should be asking why it is that they feel the need to act this way and whether enough is being done to allow them to defend themselves or to make them safe. And I don't think that that's a unreasonable question to ask in these circumstances where there are particular roads where you have constant violent attacks that sometimes lead to Jews dying and sometimes, Baruch Hashem, do not. And it's allowed to remain the case that they keep on going and keep on happening. And a rate of murder that's greater than zero is practically speaking being deemed acceptable by the defense and security forces right now. So that is all a comment on current events. And as I said before, I really want to dedicate this shiur to David and Rachel Stern, who survived one of these attacks in our land by our enemies against our people miraculously, Baruch Hashem. And as I said before, I'm in awe of them and of their courage and their commitment to Torah and Eretz Yisrael. And I truly regret not getting to participate in the Seudat Hodaya last week.
We would like to encourage our viewers to share these videos with friends and send in your responses. If you would like to obtain Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael or invite the rabbi for a speaking engagement, please email us at office@machonshilo.org.